To some, it was a powerful symbol. To others, especially the groom, it was an unwanted distraction. First came the awkward glances, then a quiet suggestion to change, and finally, a public insult. But the guard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because the moment he replied, the entire room went quiet, and by the end of the night, the groom would regret ever asking him to take it off. Want to know exactly how it unfolded? First, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. You know that particular kind of morning where London feels like it's holding its breath? That's exactly what it was like when Sergeant Elijah Fenton stood in front of his wardrobe, staring at two very different versions of himself. On the left, a sharp charcoal suit, perfectly respectable, safe, forgettable. On the right, his dress uniform, crimson tunic pressed to razor-sharp perfection, gold buttons catching the morning light, white belt bleached to brightness that actually hurts your eyes. 14 years in the Coldstream Guards had taught him precision in everything. But choosing what to wear to his niece's wedding? That was proving harder than standing guard outside Buckingham Palace in a February sleet storm. Rose wasn't just his niece. When her father, his Uncle Arthur, died in that construction accident 7 years ago, everything fell apart. Rose's mum disappeared into a bottle and never climbed back out. The rest of the family scattered like leaves in a storm, but Elijah, he showed up. Every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every moment when she needed someone to just be there. He taught her to change a tire, to throw a proper punch, and most importantly, to never let anyone interrupt her when she was speaking. Now she was getting married to some corporate type named Oliver Linley at a countryside estate. The invitation was thick cream cardstock with gold lettering, but at the bottom, in Rose's own handwriting, "Please come, I want you there." The uniform won, not because he wanted attention. He chose it because Arthur once said something that stuck. If Rose ever gets married, you make sure she knows what a real man looks like in uniform. His uncle had been a lance corporal before the accident. He used to joke that watching Elijah guard the palace was the proudest moment of his life. That red coat, he'd say, that's not just fabric, that's honour you can wear. So when the black cab pulled up to Thornfield Estate and Elijah stepped out in full dress uniform, he wasn't making a statement. He was keeping a promise to a dead man. The estate was everything you'd expect from new money trying to look like old money. Manicured gardens, unnecessary fountains, staff gliding around with champagne flutes like they were performing ballet. The other guests were picture perfect. Designer suits, expensive dresses, everyone looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine. And then there was Elijah, 6'2" of military precision in blazing red wool, standing perfectly erect with his bearskin cap tucked under his arm. Heads turned, conversations paused. A photographer raised her camera, then thought better of it. Near the entrance, whispers about surprise entertainment and bit much, don't you think? But then a voice cut through it all. "Uncle Eli!" Rose broke away from her bridesmaids and practically sprinted across the lawn, wedding dress gathered in her hands, face lighting up like Christmas morning. She threw her arms around him without caring about her carefully arranged hair. "You came," she said, pulling back to look at him. "And you wore it." "Wouldn't have missed it," he replied simply, "and he would have wanted me to." Her eyes went soft for just a moment. Then she grinned and straightened his already perfect collar. "You look like you could stand guard over the Queen herself." "Just guarding the most important person here," he said. As Rose was whisked away for photos, her maid of honour approached. "She's talked about you for years," Sarah said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah. And that uniform? It suits you." It was made for service, Elijah replied. But as they walked toward the reception area, he noticed the shift in atmosphere. Conversations died when he passed. Waiters seemed uncertain whether to treat him as security or guest. Older guests offered polite nods, while younger ones avoided eye contact. One waiter approached with champagne, then hesitated. "Are you with the ceremony, sir?" "I'm family," Elijah said simply. As guests filtered into the conservatory for the ceremony, Elijah took his assigned seat in the back row, tucked away behind a floral arrangement, but with a clear view of Rose walking down the aisle. Oliver Linley was exactly what central casting would order for wealthy businessmen playing romantic. Tall, confident, with that particular ease of someone who'd never been told no about anything important. But there was something calculating in the way his eyes flickered over the crowd, lingering just too long on Elijah's uniform. After the ceremony, guests moved to the terrace for cocktail hour. Elijah found himself guided toward a shaded corner beneath a wisteria trellis. "You might be more comfortable here, sir," suggested a waiter, who couldn't make eye contact. From his post, he watched Oliver work the crowd with practiced ease, while overhearing young guests joke about entertainment packages and overdressed security guards. Then Oliver appeared at his elbow, champagne flute in hand, and politician's smile in place. "Sergeant Fenton, isn't it?" he said smoothly. "Rose mentioned you might come." "She invited me," Elijah replied. "Of course, we're delighted to have family here." Oliver's smile tightened slightly. "I wanted a quick word about the uniform. It's quite striking." Elijah waited. "Service is admirable, absolutely, but I'm wondering if you might be more comfortable in something more casual, less ceremonial." "This is formal wear," Elijah said calmly. Oliver's laugh had sharp edges. "It's also quite military. It sends a specific message. And today isn't about tradition or ceremony. It's about family." "I am family." "Of course," Oliver backtracked. "I just meant visually. Some guests were confused. One asked if we'd hired security." Elijah met his gaze steadily. "Then let them wonder." Oliver's voice cooled. "If you reconsidered, I could have one of my groomsmen lend you a jacket to help you blend in better." Elijah's response was quiet and final. "I don't blend in. I stand." Oliver stared at him, clearly unused to being told no with such calm certainty. Then he forced his smile back and raised his champagne in a mock toast. "Right then! Well, enjoy the canapés." He walked away with quick, irritated steps, but the damage was done. Several guests had overheard, and now they were looking at Elijah differently, with the uncomfortable awareness of witnessing a power struggle. Dinner was called with the soft chiming of crystal glasses, and guests began filing into the estate's grand dining hall. The room was a masterpiece of understated wealth. Soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables dressed in cream and gold, staff moving with choreographed precision to ensure every detail was perfect. Elijah followed the gentle guidance of an usher to his assigned seat, which turned out to be at the very end of the longest table, tucked between a second cousin he hadn't seen in years and what appeared to be a member of the catering staff, who looked equally confused about his placement. The seating arrangement spoke volumes. He was technically at the family table, but just barely, close enough to be included, far enough away to be forgotten. It was the kind of subtle snub that people with money had perfected, never quite rude enough to cause a scene, but clear enough to make a point. Elijah didn't protest. He simply sat, spine straight, hands folded, and watched the room settle into its evening rhythm. Dinner progressed through multiple courses, each one more elaborate than the last, each one requiring a different fork from the bewildering array of silverware at each place setting. Elijah ate sparingly and declined the wine pairings, content to sip water and observe the theatre unfolding around him. The speeches began after the main course, Rose's maid of honour delivered a sweet, heartfelt tribute that had half the room reaching for tissues. A family friend shared amusing stories about Rose's childhood that painted her as the spirited, determined woman Elijah knew her to be. Then came the best man. Miles Hargreaves was Oliver's university roommate, the kind of guy who'd probably been captain of the rowing team and president of something impressive. He had that easy confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences, and a smile that suggested he found most of the world mildly amusing. He rose with his champagne flute raised, commanding the room's attention with practiced ease. "Oliver and Rose," he began, his voice carrying perfectly to every corner of the hall, "a couple that proves opposites really do attract. Her warmth to his ambition, her heart to his head, her authentic background to his blue-blooded family tree." Polite laughter rippled through the room. Elijah set down his water glass and listened. "Looking around this room tonight," Miles continued, his gaze sweeping over the elegant crowd, "I see success. I see tradition, but also progress. I see people who understand that the future is built by those who know how to adapt, how to evolve." His eyes found Elijah's uniform in the far corner and lingered just long enough to make his point clear. "Of course," Miles added with a smirk that would have been at home in a prep school common room, "some people dress for the job they want, others dress for the job they used to have." The laughter that followed was sharper this time, less polite and more pointed. Several guests glanced toward Elijah's corner, waiting for a reaction that never came. He simply continued sitting with perfect posture, expression unchanged, as if he were still on ceremonial duty. But the damage was done. The comment had accomplished exactly what it was meant to. It had marked him as an outsider, someone who didn't understand the rules of this particular game. What Miles hadn't counted on was the little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6, all golden curls and white ruffles, and she appeared at Elijah's elbow like a small, determined ghost. "Are you a real soldier?" she asked, in that clear, carrying voice that only children possess, completely oblivious to the adult tensions swirling around the room. The question cut through the post-speech chatter like a bell, and suddenly everyone was looking their way. Elijah looked down at her solemn little face and felt something ease in his chest. "Yes, I am." She beamed as if he'd just confirmed the existence of magic. "I knew it! You look just like the soldiers in my picture books. Are you guarding someone special?" "The most precious person in the room," he said, nodding toward Rose at the head table. The child's eyes widened. "The Princess Bride?" "Something like that." A few genuine chuckles rose from nearby tables. Not mocking this time, but charmed by the innocence of the exchange. The little girl looked around at all the watching faces, then back at Elijah, with the serious consideration that children bring to important decisions. "Can I sit with you?" she asked. Before any adult could intervene, she had climbed into the empty chair beside him and was settling in as if she belonged there. A woman who was presumably her mother started to rise, but Elijah caught her eye and gave a small shake of his head. "It's all right," he said gently. For the next few minutes, the child chattered away about her dress, the flowers, and whether he had a sword. He didn't, but she seemed optimistic that he might acquire one. The conversation was blissfully normal, wonderfully uncomplicated, and it seemed to diffuse some of the tension that had been building in the room. When the child's mother finally came to collect her, whispering apologies for the interruption, Elijah stood and offered the little girl his hand. "Thank you for keeping me company," he said formally, as if she were visiting royalty. She giggled and gave him a wobbly curtsy that would have done credit to any princess, then skipped back to her family's table, chattering excitedly about her new soldier friend. The interaction was brief, innocent, and absolutely genuine. It was also the exact opposite of everything Oliver had been trying to orchestrate all evening. Elijah could feel the groom's eyes on him from across the room, and when he looked up, Oliver's expression was thunderous. The confrontation was coming, and they both knew it. As the evening moved into its final phase and guests began to drift between the dining hall and the terrace for dancing, Elijah quietly excused himself. He needed air, space, and a moment to collect himself before whatever was about to happen. The gardens were peaceful in contrast to the noise inside. Soft shadows cast by string lights, the whisper of breeze through carefully tended hedges, the distant sound of music and laughter floating from the estate's windows. Elijah stood on a stone path between two rows of roses, hands clasped behind his back, posture as perfect as if he were still on duty. He wasn't hiding, he was simply taking a moment of quiet before the storm. "There you are." He turned to find Rose approaching, shoes in her hand, the hem of her dress gathered to keep it off the dew-damp grass. She looked radiant but tired, her carefully arranged hair now tousled from dancing, cheeks flushed from champagne and joy. "You always did hate crowds," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Old habits." They stood together in comfortable silence, the kind that comes between people who've shared enough history that words aren't always necessary. The music drifted over the garden walls, something slow and romantic that belonged to the kind of wedding fairy tales are made of. "I saw what happened at dinner," Rose said quietly. "Miles can be a lot." Elijah shrugged slightly. "I've heard worse." "That doesn't make it right." She looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "And I'm sorry about the seating. I didn't see the chart until this morning. Oliver's mother handled the arrangements." "It's fine, Rose. I had a good view of what mattered." She smiled at that, but it wavered around the edges. "They don't understand his family. They think military service is outdated or unnecessary. They live in a different world." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He'd spent enough years dealing with people who couldn't see past the uniform to understand the person wearing it. "Do you remember," Rose said suddenly, "when I was 10 and wouldn't stop crying at Dad's funeral? You held my hand through the entire service, never let go once. Your father deserved someone to stand still for him." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Rose understood what he meant, that standing vigil, keeping watch, being present when it mattered, was what honour looked like. "You're the only one who kept showing up after he died," she continued. "Mum fell apart. Everyone else found reasons to be somewhere else. But you just kept coming. Your family." She looked up at him with that expression he remembered from her childhood. Serious, determined, a little fierce. "That uniform you're wearing, it means something to me. It always has. It's not just ceremony or tradition. It's everything you did for me." "I wore it for him today," Elijah said quietly. "And for you." They stood there for another moment, the weight of shared history settling around them like a comfortable blanket. Then Rose straightened, wiping at her eyes. "I should get back. They'll be looking for me." Elijah nodded. "Go be radiant." But as she turned to go, she paused. "Don't disappear on me, okay? Whatever happens in there, don't just vanish." "I won't." She smiled, squeezed his arm once, and headed back toward the lights and music. Elijah watched her go, then turned back to the quiet garden. He knew what was waiting for him inside, but he also knew what he owed her, and what he owed the memory of the man who'd raised them both. Whatever was coming, he'd face it the same way he faced everything else, standing straight, eyes forward, unmoved by the storm. When Elijah finally returned to the estate's grand hall, the dancing was in full swing. The string quartet had been replaced by a small jazz ensemble, and couples swayed beneath the chandeliers, while others clustered around the bar, voices growing louder and laughter more frequent as the evening wore on. He'd barely stepped inside when he spotted Oliver near the far wall, deep in what looked like an increasingly heated conversation with his parents. Even from across the room, Elijah could read the body language, Oliver's stiff posture, his mother's nervous gestures, his father's attempted mediation. As if sensing his presence, Oliver looked up and their eyes met across the crowded dance floor. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Oliver said something sharp to his parents and began walking directly toward him, weaving between dancing couples with determined strides. Elijah didn't retreat. He didn't seek allies or look for escape routes. He simply stood where he was and waited. Oliver arrived with his jaw set and his politician's mask finally slipped. This wasn't the smooth, charming Groom anymore. This was a man who'd had enough of sharing his spotlight. "Enjoying the party?" Oliver asked, his voice carrying just enough edge to be noticed by nearby guests. "It's a beautiful wedding," Elijah replied evenly. "Yes, it is. My wedding. Rose's wedding. Our day." Oliver stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not his intensity. "Not a recruitment advertisement for Her Majesty's Armed Forces." Elijah didn't rise to the bait. "I'm not recruiting anyone." "No? Then what exactly are you doing, standing there in that—" Oliver gestured dismissively at the uniform. "That costume, drawing attention, making yourself the centre of every conversation. I'm attending my niece's wedding. In a palace guard outfit that belongs in a museum, not a family celebration." Oliver's voice was rising now, drawing glances from other guests. "This is supposed to be dignified, elegant, not some sort of military pageant." A few couples had stopped dancing. Conversations were beginning to pause. Even the jazz ensemble seemed to be playing more quietly, as if sensing the shift in atmosphere. Elijah remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged. "The uniform represents service, Mr. Linley. It represents honour." "It represents the past," Oliver snapped. "Standing around in a red coat while tourists take pictures isn't service, it's theatre." "You don't know what service means." The words were quiet, but they cut through the room like a blade. Several guests had turned now, forming a loose circle around the two men. Someone whispered for the music to stop. Oliver's face flushed. "Excuse me?" "I said you don't know what service means," Elijah repeated, his voice carrying despite its measured tone. "You see ceremony and think it's performance. You see tradition and call it costume." "I see someone clinging to relevance by wearing a uniform that belongs to yesterday," Oliver shot back. "What exactly have you accomplished except standing still for tourists?" The room had gone completely quiet now. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen with trays in their hands, as they watched the confrontation unfold. Elijah looked at Oliver for a long moment, then spoke with the calm precision that came from years of real discipline. "I wore this uniform because Rose's father, who couldn't be here today, once told me, if Rose ever gets married, make sure she's marrying someone worthy. I stood for him today, the same way I stood for him when we buried him, in uniform. Because that's the kind of man he was." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the crowd. Someone in the back whispered, "That's her father figure." Another voice murmured, "He raised her after her dad died." Oliver opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time all evening, his perfect composure cracked completely. Then a new voice cut through the silence. "And that man earned the right to wear that uniform in ways you'll never understand." Everyone turned. An older gentleman had stepped forward from the crowd, tall, distinguished, wearing a regimental tie that marked him as military. Rose's godfather, though few of the wedding guests knew his background. "Colonel Matthews, Coldstream Guards, retired," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need volume. "I know Sergeant Fenton's service record. 2 tours in Afghanistan, commendation for valour under fire, cited for maintaining discipline during a mortar attack while evacuating civilians." The room was dead silent now. "He didn't wear that uniform for show," Colonel Matthews continued, his gaze fixed on Oliver. "He wore it for family, for tradition, for honour. Things that can't be bought or borrowed or faked." Oliver's face had gone very pale. I didn't know." "No," the colonel said quietly, "you didn't, but you assumed. And that tells us everything we need to know about your character." The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, Oliver's mother appeared at his elbow, whispering urgently in his ear. He nodded stiffly, muttered something that might have been an apology, and allowed himself to be led away toward a side exit. But the damage was done, not to Elijah, to Oliver. The groom had revealed himself completely in front of all his guests, and everyone present understood exactly what they'd witnessed. Elijah gave a slight nod to Colonel Matthews, then began to move toward the exit himself. Not in triumph, not in anger, just with the quiet dignity of someone who'd said what needed to be said and had nothing more to prove. As he passed through the crowd, something unexpected happened. Applause began, scattered at first, then growing stronger. Not thunderous or dramatic, but steady and sincere. The kind of applause that says, "Well done," rather than "good show." An elderly woman touched his arm as he passed. "Thank you for wearing the uniform," she said softly. "My father would have understood." A young man, barely out of university, straightened his shoulders as Elijah walked by and gave a respectful nod. "My grandfather served in the Guards," he said. "He always said it was an honor to wear the red." But the most meaningful response came from the little girl who'd sat with him at dinner. She broke away from her mother and ran over to tug on his sleeve. "Are you leaving?" she asked, looking up at him with wide, concerned eyes. Elijah knelt down to her level. "I think it's time for me to go." She considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important matters. Then she reached up and patted his shoulder where his service stripes were displayed. "You're the best soldier I ever met," she announced. He smiled, the first genuine smile he'd shown all evening. "Thank you, miss. That means more than you know." As he stood and headed for the door, he heard the music starting up again behind him. The party would continue, but it would never be quite the same. Too much truth had been spoken, too many masks had slipped. Outside, the night air was cool and clean after the hothouse atmosphere of the reception. Elijah walked down the gravel drive toward the road where he'd called for a taxi, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. Behind him, light spilled from the estate's windows, and he could hear the distant sound of conversation and music resuming. But it sounded different now, muted, uncertain, like people trying to pretend they hadn't just witnessed something that changed everything. His phone buzzed with a text message from Rose. "I'm proud of you, always have been, always will be. Thank you for standing up for Dad, for me, for what matters." Elijah looked at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "That's what family does." The taxi arrived a few minutes later, and as they drove away from the estate, Elijah caught a glimpse of Oliver in an upstairs window, still and alone, staring out into the darkness. Some lessons, he reflected, come harder than others, but they all come eventually. 2 weeks later, his phone rang while he was polishing his boots for morning drill. "Uncle Eli?" Rose's voice was quiet, tired, but somehow lighter than it had been in months. "Hello, love. How are you holding up?" "The marriage is over," she said simply. "I filed the papers yesterday. Oliver, he showed me who he really was that night, and I finally listened." Elijah set down his boot brush and gave her his full attention. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right. I'm free." She paused. "I wanted to thank you for wearing the uniform, for standing up, for showing me the difference between a man who demands respect and a man who earns it. Your father would be proud of you." "I hope so. And, Eli, next time I get married, if there is a next time, I want you to walk me down the aisle in uniform, because that's what real family looks like." Elijah smiled, even though she couldn't see it. "It would be my honor." After they hung up, he returned to polishing his boots with the methodical precision that had become second nature. Tomorrow he'd stand guard again, motionless and dignified, while tourists took their photos and made their jokes. But today, he'd done something more important than guard a palace. He'd guarded the truth. He'd stood for honor. He'd shown a young woman what love looks like when it wears a uniform and refuses to be moved by anything less than respect. And sometimes that's exactly what family means. So what do you think? When someone tries to make you feel ashamed of who you are, do you compromise to keep the peace? Or do you stand your ground the way Sergeant Fenton did? And here's the bigger question. In a world where image seems to matter more than substance, is there still power in wearing your values on your sleeve? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And these conversations matter more than you might think. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you what real strength looks like, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more than you know. Make sure to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the incredible men and women who guard these traditions with their lives. And if you know someone who thinks uniforms are just for show, share this video with them. It might change their mind about what service really means. Our next Royal Guard story is already waiting on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real honor doesn't demand recognition. It simply stands. And when it does, even the loudest voices in the world discover they have nothing left to say.